a warm welcome to the very first edition of Invest Africa. I'm Bronwyn Nielsen. Over the coming weeks, we'll be taking an in-depth look at the challenges and opportunities associated with investing in Africa. We'll be travelling up and down the continent, getting insight into the various economic territories across Africa. The 22nd edition of the World Economic Forum recently took place in the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. Themed Shaping Africa's Transformation, the conference hosted delegates from over 70 countries to discuss the future of the region and to map out a blueprint for economic growth. Let's take a look.
At least 700 delegates from around Africa and the world gathered here in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to discuss and debate some of the issues that are required to drive Africa's growth agenda forward. With the ongoing financial turmoil in traditional investment markets such as the US and Europe, investment and expansion into Africa was at the top of the forum's agenda.
These are economies that are very, very high growth. Growth rates far in excess of ours and the rest of the developed world. It's our backyard, Africa. I think our banks are able to come in and set up some pretty inexpensive acquisitions. From an investment banking perspective, we cover the continent. We have the hub model. Where do we put our own money is the question, and we put our own money almost exclusively into African land.
Well, I think for us as a development institution working with the private sector, it's important that we are here so we can help companies that want to come in or the local companies to expand and go regional, because I think you need to integrate Africa more, and this is a great opportunity for investments now in Africa. Africa is rising, and right now what we see is that Africa is growing, 5%. That's many, and out of the top 7 growing countries in the world, or top 10, 7 are actually in Africa.
With African economies expanding, it's natural there was a focus on building and integrating Africa's fragmented capital markets.
People need to understand what integration means. Integration means having common standards, having common laws, sharing systems, and making sure that each of the individual markets are strong. Some of the reasons why people are talking about integration is that some of our markets are small. Yes. And when markets are small, they're not as liquid as they should be. It will make the cost of transactions cheaper if we're sharing systems. If we have common standards, it will make sure that investors who invest in Southern Africa will already be familiar with the standards they will invest in East Africa or in West Africa.
Given the crucial role that infrastructure and investment play in facilitating Africa's transformation, both socially and economically, delegates across the board acknowledged that although there has been substantial progress, even more remained to be done.
Well, there have been a lot of discussions about the funding for infrastructure. There's a lot of discussion about why we need infrastructure, because we can't build infrastructure for the sake of building infrastructure. And what has come out is that Africa needs to industrialize so that we can trade amongst ourselves, we can exchange commodities and trap capital on the African continent.
With a large portion of African farmers regarded as subsistence farmers, and with the continent sitting with 60% of the world's arable land, transformation of the agriculture industry on the continent remains a priority.
There was very serious disinvestment in agriculture the last 30 years. And then we had the food crisis in 2008 and 2009. And subsequently, both governments of African countries and the international development community realized that this was a red signal. And since then, there has been some efforts to try to galvanize additional resources, both from governments and from development partners, but more recently, getting the private sector to be involved. The recognition that Africa, even though it has challenges with respect to food security, when you take those challenges and turn them around, you have tremendous opportunities.
Joining me now in the studio to give us their views on this year's conference and what it means for investment in Africa is Josvat Maura, CEO and Senior Partner, KPMG East Africa, Lynette Chen, CEO, NEPAD Business Foundation, and Yunus Suleiman, Chairman, KPMG Africa. Thank you all so much for your time. Well, it was certainly a week of robust debate and many opportunities coming to the fore. Yunus, let's kick off with you. In terms of the highlight when it comes to opportunities, what would you say that was?
I think the highlight was riding in this blue taxi.
I must admit the blue taxis did stand out. We were battling to get up the hills most of the time.
But I think it was an excellent experience. If you look at Invest Africa, I mean, the countries that are now more sought after from a developing and emerging market point of view is the high growth countries in Africa. And it's mainly because of the actual economic crisis in the Western world. So I think in terms of exciting opportunities, that what we saw come out of this World Economic Forum for Africa is that there's huge opportunity for really great returns in Africa, especially in the context of the middle market emergence, as well as everyone's seeking our natural resources. And ultimately, as was mentioned earlier, the investment in infrastructure. And that, I think, is attracting more and more sort of interest in this high growth continent of ours.
We need to marry those high returns, obviously, with high risk. Do you think that that is still a prevalent concern, that doing business on the continent is very, very risky? Or are we changing that perception?
I certainly think that with the implementation of NEPAD as a social and economic development framework for Africa over the last 11 years, and through mechanisms like the African peer review mechanism, which promotes transparency and accountability amongst governments, that there has been a lessening of risk, and the investment appetite into Africa has definitely increased. We also see that through NEPAD there is a lot more cooperation and willingness from a political level to collaborate between country governments for regional integration, particularly around infrastructure, around agriculture, around industrialization, and certainly that has lessened the risk of investment in Africa.
One of the themes to emanate from WEF was obviously the fact that it is time now to invest in Africa. Many people saying that we are about 20 years behind China. If you don't invest now, you're going to be seriously sorry 10, 15 years out. Is that the reality?
That's the reality, and Africa is an understated investment opportunity. And you know, there are various reasons for that. First of all, the crisis in Western Europe and North America meant that there were very limited growth opportunities there. But they were all looking to the east for growth. But when they went to China and India, which were the markets that were looking for growth opportunities, they found nobody home. And they asked, where are the Chinese, where are the Indians? They're in Africa. And they followed them into Africa. And so now you've got this huge scramble for Africa. And you could see that even from the profile of the participants at the WEF. In fact, I thought from that profile, you had more non-African participants who are interested in coming into the continent or who are already doing business in the continent, attending the forum, understanding better the opportunities. And one thing that you actually get every time you go to a forum like that or you go to an African country is surprise. Many people are surprised by Ethiopia, by the facilities, by the quality of the conference, by the amount of development that was going on, by the number of global organizations that are there, because Ethiopia has got this sort of negative perception that it's a closed economy. But the Prime Minister was able to explain which bits they are not able to open up now and where they are at with everybody else, including manufacturing. So it is time to be in the continent. And what I'm finding is that many people who are not going to be here now will be paying a premium to invest if they wait another 10 to 15 years.
Was there enough emphasis placed on the turmoil in the developed world and what impact that is going to have on Africa going forward? We know it's certainly not over in terms of the turmoil. Did you have discussions along those lines with many of your peers?
I think there was a bit of discussion, but not enough focus on the rest of the world. I think the key thing was that the focus was on Africa. And the theme was the transformation and the shaping of the actual continent's economic environment. So I think that the right thing was done because this conference was focusing on Africa. The need was to focus and showcase Africa in terms of what opportunities there are, like Josephat said, in terms of the actual participants, so that they can bring their companies to invest in the appropriate industries and the opportunities then that present themselves. So I think from that perspective, it was, I think everyone acknowledges that the rest of the world is not going to give them that investment. And the risks of going anywhere else other than Africa is really not in anyone's interest. And the fact that agriculture, as Lynette says, is also a very important facet to focus on in terms of food security as well, and to feed Africans first. But the fact of the matter is, Africa is receiving the second highest investment, foreign direct investment in the world in 2010.
Lynette, do you think that's a trend set to continue? Is FDI only going to continue to flow faster and heavier into South Africa, into Africa?
Definitely. As mentioned, Africa's mineral resources are sort of the most sought after commodity. The second biggest natural resource that's being sought after is land and agriculture because of the food security issues. And you're finding countries from abroad are now buying up huge tracts of land where they're farming and exporting raw materials. And again, what I've cautioned at WEF is that we need to ensure that we do not follow necessarily the same steps as experienced in the mineral sector, where we are actually processing, beneficiating and exporting finished goods. And that there is, first of all, sufficient food to feed Africans and then feed the rest of the world, because we have that capability. So I definitely think the FDI will continue to flow in Africa because we have such huge areas of need. There is, opportunity everywhere. We are needing basic infrastructure, water, sanitation, housing, healthcare services. So, we need to grow a lot. And as mentioned earlier, Ethiopia was, I think, very exciting because I think globally there was this perception of 25 years ago, Ethiopia is a starving country, the famine-ridden, starving children. And when you arrive there, there's construction happening on every street corner. These skyscrapers going up, world-class facilities, the African Union building.
Did you find that family and friends before you went up were slightly concerned that you were going into darkest Africa and you had to set the story right when you got back home?
Well, actually, it's been about my 4th or 5th trip. So, at my first trip there, I was very impressed, and I still continue to be impressed each visit because there's so much development going on.
Josvat, just in terms of the East Africa community, you're seeing great things happening on the ground there. We're going to chat about the integration emanating from that territory directly after this short commercial break, so just hold that thought. As I said, we're going to a quick commercial break. We'll be back with more insights from the World Economic Forum on Africa when we return. Welcome back to Invest Africa. This week we're focusing on some of the key insights from this year's World Economic Forum on Africa, which was held in Ethiopia just over a week ago. Still with me in studio, Josvat Maura, his CEO and senior partner, KPMG East Africa, Lynette Chen, CEO, NEPAD Business Foundation, and Yunus Suleiman, Chairman, KPMG Africa. Before we continue with our discussion, also on the agenda at WEF Africa was the development of the Triple Free Trade Agreement and the Cape to Cairo Free Trade Zone. Let's take a look.
One of the hot topics at this year's World Economic Forum on Africa in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, was regional integration. Now, with the Cape to Cairo project, which seeks to integrate 26 African economies into one huge free trade zone, the question is, what policies are required to create a trade zone of this size and scale? In order for agricultural produce to cross borders and money to flow between markets, the importance of regional trade and integration was also highlighted at this year's forum.
In fact, if you look at, say, from what Cecil Rhodes had dreamt from Cape to Cairo, there are now very few missing links for it to be finished. And the east-west, if you take, say, Mombasa to Dakar, there are also very few links to be finished. And there are a number of sub-corridors, like from North Africa to the ports in West Africa, and also in Eastern Africa, you have all these corridors. For instance, Central Africa, all those programs are now being prepared to be bankable for implementation and bringing in not only African government, but also private investors and the international community to participate in them.
The question of infrastructure, if we were able to get it right, would really unlock a lot of the integration issues that we're battling with. We lack institutions that financially can borrow and implement. And we don't really have regional integration instruments. What am I saying? We have institutions that can package deals, that can do studies, that can prepare the way. We really need to devise this financing instrument that we can then use to apply. And I think it's vital to link the landlocked countries.
We do have some of them in different forms. So you have the African Development Bank as one institution, but it's overloaded. It needs to get more capacity and more capital. We have the Development Bank of Southern Africa. I see there's an Ethiopian Development Bank. There'll be other institutions. But I think what Ngozi is saying is how do we leverage all of those to a completely new level? How do we get better project planning? How do we decentralize that in a way in which that planning capability and project preparation capability is available both to support the Africa-wide infrastructure, but also national infrastructure as well.
These corridors that link, especially us as the landlocked countries, are key to our economic development, also attracting investment. And what we are doing through this regional integration that we are talking about is really to ease transport along these corridors. It's not just an issue of investing in having a good road, but also investing in ensuring that there's smooth movement of traffic along these corridors. And that's what we are tackling as a region, removing all the non-tariff barriers that are along these routes. When we establish a single customs union, it makes it easier for goods transiting or coming from abroad. So from Mombasa to Kigali, it's like moving within one country, and all these barriers are removed. That's what we are working on.
Josvat, a big focus was obviously the integration. East Africa community appears to be forging the way on this front. You seem to be ahead of the game when it comes to the free movement of people, goods, and capital. What is it that you're doing right, and should everyone else follow your example?
I think from an East African perspective, first of all, we have the benefit of history. That up to 1977, we had the East African community, and which collapsed because of political reasons. So we have some experience and some lessons that we had to learn from. And the biggest driver for East African integration is the realization of the benefits and the differences between the economies, and how comparative advantage, for example, the innovation coming out of Rwanda can be utilized in a much bigger market, or the capacity, the manufacturing capacity in Kenya can be sold to a much bigger market, or the productive land in Tanzania can serve the rest of the region. But there are a number of issues. First of all, recognizing the opportunity, the leadership commitment. The leaders have been committed and they have put together a roadmap. We may not have achieved all the milestones that we wanted to achieve within there. Secondly, the economies of scale.
Good leadership and governance, obviously a big theme, sub-theme at the World Economic Forum. So you've got that right. Big tick in the box.
Yes, so we've got that. So the other thing is the whole issue of economies of scale. When you're talking, for example, from Mombasa all the way to Rwanda,
through the northern corridor.
Through the northern corridor, or from Dar es Salaam, again all the way to Rwanda and Burundi. Those are significant investments. And we need to be able to provide a much bigger market for any investor to come in to invest in that. So that's infrastructure, and working with NEPAD as well is leading in terms of this integration. But above all, trade and trade integration actually preceded the formal integration, because the peoples of East Africa were doing business between each other even before we came to the formal integration. So there are some of these opportunities that are available. And being a huge continent of 30 million square kilometers, we have to find what I would call comparative advantage in regional economic blocks, work around the infrastructure and the capacity and the institutions required in each region, West Africa, Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, the Maghreb region, and then ensure that that infrastructure is also integrated, and then you just get the market.
I want to bring Lynette in on the infrastructure, because you held a separate session on infrastructure, and to Josvat's point, it is about pooling those infrastructure projects, perhaps as regional players. Did you investigate that theme?
Yes, the NEPAD Business Foundation, in partnership with the World Economic Forum, held a private session on the 9th of May to discuss three themes: funding and financing of infrastructure projects. Second is innovative new models of public-private partnerships. And the third is to look at local economic development that is impacted with infrastructure, which leads to job creation, supporting local enterprises, etc. And also, of course, the maintenance and the skills required to maintain these infrastructures once the projects have been finished. So we did this under the theme of PIDA, the Program for Infrastructure Infrastructure Development for Africa, which is the continental framework for infrastructure development, of which there are 51 projects that have been put into short, medium and long-term goals. And out of that, there are 7 priority projects that have been highlighted that are almost near bankable stage. And so what we are doing together with WEF, African Development Bank and the NEPAD agency, we will be mobilizing private sector support to look at how can we fund and finance these 8 priority projects in a very innovative way. Because if we follow the traditional method of implementing these infrastructure projects, they'll continue to be on that list for the next 20 years. And so we will be hosting a conference on the 10th and 11th of July at the Centre Convention Centre to look at African infrastructure and also to mobilize this private sector support to deliver these programs and projects.
Eunice, what about Praveen Gordon's comment there that it's a dearth of financial institutions that is a huge barrier to the integration of the continent and further to the development of trade and cross-border trade?
I think that, you know, as Minister Gordon mentioned, there's a number of development institutions that are keen to invest in Africa. But the one thing I just wanted to mention before we get into answering that question was the question of the European Union. You know, we talk about integration and really the exciting things that can happen about moving goods and services and whatever else going across the continent. But we must learn from the experience that the European Union has had in terms of the economic crisis, in terms of the way they've been structured, and to caution against that, to make sure we don't repeat
the fallout that they're going through right now.
We don't repeat those mistakes. But getting back to the question of funding and the investment environment and also the question of development institutions, I think they are keen to invest. Like Lynette talked about the 51 projects that are in progress, I don't think there's a shortage of funding. I think the key thing is that companies are wanting to get the, call it environment and infrastructural, let's call it investment going sooner rather than later. And we've seen that happen in the Southern African region where there are lots of investment. I mean, you talk about Transnet investing 300 billion and creating 580,000 jobs. We just had to replicate those kind of things. But I think we've seen the African Development Bank, even the Industrial Development Corporation and the South African Development Bank of South Africa also lining up to invest in these kind of initiatives and to make sure we get the infrastructure right to get Africa to where it really deserves. It's the, you know, the continent's time has come for that.
We're touching on these sub-themes and we've spoken about the leadership aspect in East Africa community, the good governance, then obviously investment, we continue to talk about that, the innovation element. That was a strong sub-theme. Are we seeing innovation on the continent?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I mean, there were a number of areas that were covered within a number of sessions. First of all, in the whole area of telecommunications and the use of technology, recognizing that Africa can quantum leap the rest of the world in terms of the innovative use of technology, whether it's in the provision of healthcare, whether it's in the delivery of education, whether it's in the delivery of financial services, and we've seen some of those actually materialize. So there are a number of innovative solutions that are actually coming out of the continent that Africa is actually leading the rest of the world. You've seen sort of technology-based solutions like Ushahidi, which was also presented and shared at WEF, being used beyond the initial monitoring of the crisis in Kenya to everything from earthquake and disaster management in the rest of the world. There was a session on managing the rural-urban and urbanization complexity, and again the innovative solutions and lessons that we learned from that. So the whole theme of innovation, and first of all recognizing that because of our huge development gap, we cannot follow the same path the rest of the world has followed. We have to apply the lessons that have been learned from the rest of the world. We have to apply the developments in technology to bridge that gap much faster, because we don't have 50 years, because people would not be alive in 50 years.
We are running out of time, but Eunice, from what you've seen on the ground, you've attended numerous of the Africa World Economic Forum series, of course, as well as Davos and et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to the Africa series, are you seeing changes from one function to another? Is there implementation happening?
No, definitely. I think it, you know, the one thing that really stood out for me was the visit to Bethlehem's Real Soul factory. You know, the significant amount of talent that there is in Africa is fundamental, and I think this was the first, let's call it the WEF that I've attended, where I actually went out on one of these tours. And that was really unique. And I think that generally speaking, when you look at our National Planning Commission vision for 2030, it's about creating employment. And employment creation can come from these small and medium enterprises, and I think that's what we're seeing more of it happening. There's a lot more focus on creating employment and harnessing the talent we have on the continent, and that's what's going to help our continent, in fact, not just the countries, grow at a faster pace. And I think what I've seen in this WEF was really that exciting venture into really innovative and different ventures to create more employment for the continent.
Lynette, I'm going to ask you the same thing. Are things changing?
I definitely think that this last WEF was certainly more positive, because in the previous WEFs we spoke about poverty, disease, HIV, AIDS, etc. And the agenda this year was more positive. It didn't mention any of those words. It looked at innovation, it looked at leadership, etc., and the exciting opportunities in Africa. I also know that in BF, in partnership with WEF, we are taking a lot of these projects, like, for example, in the water and infrastructure and even agriculture, to implementations phase. So I think that there is, it's not just a lot of talk, there is a lot of implementation going on as well.
And Josvat, just in conclusion, I'm going to give you the table in terms of what you expect to emanate now from this session into next year's session. Do you think we're going to see, and I keep referring back to this terminology, execution, execution, execution?
I think we are going to see execution. For me, one of the most positive things out of the WEF was that we have seen the evidence of the changing perception of Africa. Africa is no longer the dark continent full of conflicts and hunger. People are now beginning to see the huge opportunities within the continent, and you can count the number of global businesses that are doing very good work within the continent and have some of the highest returns in their own businesses, whether it's in finance, whether you're talking about extraction, whether you're talking about manufacturing, they have them within the continent. So what I'm expecting in the coming year, there's going to be a lot more investment in the continent. We have seen that in East Africa, a lot of the international organizations, global organizations already coming in, establishing within East Africa. We've seen, for example, Ethiopia attracting a lot of attention with its 90 million people, the discovery of oil in Kenya, in Uganda, the huge gas deposits in Mozambique and Tanzania. So there's going to be a lot more coming in. The other uncelebrated feature of the continent is the quality of our human resource. If we actually were to do a lot of data analytics and carry out a census of the educated people, the technically trained people within the continent, you will find that many of the organizations that are coming in here are finding the resources within the continent as well as the returning diaspora. So this is a continent that has got the resources, that has got the capacity, and that is ready for business. I'm looking forward to the coming year.
Well, Eunice, Lynette and Josvat, thank you so much for joining us for this first episode of Invest Africa. That's the end of it. We'll be back again at the same time next week. Until then, from me, Bronwyn Nielsen, and my guests, it's a very goodbye.